I look forward to seeing it.
Yeah. Yeah, Rabbi.
All right, we're all set?
Your friend's not here yet. She's
Yeah.
not coming.
Yeah.
She's gone.
What he should put on?
She's staying in New Jersey.
Oh, really? Listen, you know, I'm not quite as old as some of you, but I'm getting close. They're waiting for you. And I'm also like waiting, you know, there might be a time where I also feel I have to relocate me or my children. Like last year I was sick, I don't have some.
You're going to London.
I'm not going to London, but I have other kids up north here in the US. You know, they can't keep running back and forth. So
I'm late.
yeah. Don't worry, I didn't begin yet. So you're all set. Come over here though, because I have things. You weren't here last week, were you? Right.
I just came in. She just
fine,
came
no
in.
problem. So let me just give you.
Good morning.
All right, and then take this. So I'll recap what I did last week.
Okay, wonderful.
All right. Yeah, but just give it back if you don't mind.
You know, I'm saying this over. Let's give me some.
I know you feel a little, it's a miserable, right? Okay, excellent. Okay, great to see you. Anybody else comes in, I'll give them. All right, so I started now a new unit. Last year, we concentrated a lot on the Jews of Germany. And then we talked about the rise of the Reform movement, and then the reaction of the Orthodox Rabbanim to the rise of Reform. But now I'm moving to Eastern Europe. And I mentioned last time, most of us come from there, right? Right. Most of you come from there. It's funny, I was looking at the map. My Zeta, my one set of grandparents came from Lithuania.
Oh,
my other set, also a bit fun.
My mother is from Lithuania, my father is from Latvia.
Oh, okay. That's interesting. You're going to find out something. Interesting.
Good.
All right.
Good.
So my other Zeta and my grandma, too, I know she was born in the US, but her parents also came from home. Anyway, he came from Suva. So I looked it up on a map of Poland, and it's like in the middle of Poland. My mother always used to say, I guess she got this from her father, oh, that it was near the German border. And it's certainly not anymore. So I'll be giving it out soon. I have a map of the Jews of Russia, of the Pale Settlement, and Suwałk was on the border with Prussia. It was, because my mother's maiden name is Eisenberg, and that's a German word. Eisen means iron. Right. So I know they must have lived. I don't know why they chose that way. I don't think the iron.
The iron mountain. She must be an iron mountain.
An iron what?
Mountain.
Berg means a mountain?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So I have no idea why they end up choosing that name or, you know, on that side. But as I said, when I was looking it up, Suwałk stuff, like little Poland, but it was in the days of the Pale Settlement. It was very close to what was then the Prussian border. So now it all makes sense. Everything's coming together. All right. So what we did last time, we talked about how did all these Jews end up in Russia. I mentioned if you ever do a genealogical research to find out when your grandparents or great grandparents, whatever, came to America, they it always, you know, and I know that they came from Poland or Lithuania, but on the ship manifest or in the immigration papers, it always says they came from Russia, because at that point it was all under the Pale Settlement, which was ruled over by Russia. So you know, today we would say they came from Poland and or Lithuania, but in those days we're talking about the 1800s. No, it's more like the 1900s. You know, they are already under Russian rule. How did it come to be?
How did it come to be? Is in Latvia, the Hochschule, the gymnasium is in Germany.
Right.
So they had a German.
Well, that was considered to be also very cultural language. So, you know,
that's the reason.
at that time. But it's interesting, the Russian aristocracy, when these are, they spoke French. I mean, I presume they knew Russian, but they spoke French because they considered that very, Parisian, very cultured also. So they were, and Russian was more like the peasants' language, but that would be nobility would have been, as I, not German so much, although some knew German, but I think French. Like if you even read Tolkien. Okay, so how did all in because there were three partitions of Polish government that's getting weaker and weaker over time, especially throughout those 1700s, and eventually became a land grant. The bulk of the land did go to Russia. Some went to Prussia. That wasn't called Germany yet. Some of it went to Prussia, and some of it went to Austria. So like all of a sudden, up until now, the Russians did not want any Jews in their territories. There were very, very few Jews who actually lived in, what it was known as Russia. The Tsars were ruling. But all of a sudden, at the end of the 1700s, beginning of the 1800s, first several 100,000 Jews came under Russian rule, and then it was 1 million. Can you imagine? 1 million Jews came under the rule. They did not like the Jews one iota. But what were they going to do? With all these people, these brilliant ideas. So they had to make some sort of accommodation. So they wanted to restrict the area, the territory, where these Jews could settle. Again, they didn't want them into what they considered their pure Russian land. So they a division, and they called it the Pale Settlement. So I looked it up. Remember, I said I didn't know, where did that word "pale" a settlement come from? And I always look in several sources. So I did Dr. Google. God bless him. Dr. Google said it's actually a very archaic word, pale. It comes from the Latin word is palus, P-A-L-U-S, and it means a fenced in. All right, so this was his enclosed settlement. I actually have the Russian word for it. I know that Russian. It's not for those who called Sherta Ossilovsky. It doesn't mean anything to me because I don't know any Russian. Anybody here know Russian? No, okay. But I was just curious because they didn't call it the Pale Settlement. The Pale Settlement actually was given to it later into the 19th century. So at the time, it just was, it was again this territory, right, that they so-called fenced in, enclosed, right? And the Jew, you could not move from one place to another. You had to stay where you were. So the Jews, and especially at this point, things are opening up, trade and commerce. And some of the Jews would have loved to have gone to, let's say, Moscow or St. Petersburg, but they were not allowed. All right. At a later point, they do, or the wealthier ones were permitted to go, or if you were a highly educated Jew, they might have permitted you to meet in those cities. But other than that's why both of us, we all come from what's called that Pale Settlement, and life was usually pretty miserable, And so we'll go into it. We're going to talk about this initial the partition of Poland and the establishment of the Pale Settlement that occurs under the reign of Tsarina. Catherine, she was actually Catherine II. I have to look at them. I'm not sure who Catherine is. Anybody of great importance. This is famous. Tsarina. She actually was a German princess, but she was, was a marriage of, alliances. So she was married to the man, that one, he was the prince, right? This guy that was not too smart, she actually had several lovers. I mean, whatever. She becomes the ruler of Russia. She was a very strong, personality, right? And she rules over there for hundreds of years. Let me see, her years were 1762. These are the years she reigned, not what she did. So she started reigning in the year 1762, and she reigned all the way up until 1796. All right, and she does have one son, but who knows what people do. You know what? He becomes king after. His name was Paul. First, we don't know. He was sort of also ineffectual, because maybe he was legitimately inherited with bad genes from his father. He was ultimately assassinated. And who follows him is the next czar, who we're going to talk more about. His name was Alexander, and this is Alexander the First. The second and the third, but he's Alexander the First. And he reigned from 1801 to 1825. So that's what we're going to be concentrating on today. We're going to talk about what it was like for the Jews, under his reign. Again, just to remind you, the Pale of Settlement was established during Tsarina Catherine the Great's reign. But then, obviously Alexander's not going to be inheriting this, and there are now 1 million Jews. And by the end of that century, so by 1900, there are 5 million Jews living in the Pale Settlement. Again, some will gradually get permission to live out of it, but the bulk of the Jews, are there. Do you have a map of the Pale Settlement, or do I have to give you another map? I need to show you something.
This is this one.
I'm trying to think. Let me see.
I have one, the Jews of Russia.
Yeah. Wait, you have something that says the
That's
Jews?
it. No, I don't. I have the Jews of Russia. No, I don't have the Jews of Austria. Oh, I don't have that one.
All right. Let me just make sure. Yeah, so there's one that says the Jews of Russia, and the second page says the Jewish Pale Settlement. So you need that? Okay.
The Jews of Eastern Europe.
Okay.
This is, Jewish Pale Settlement.
Yeah, that's what I want you to see.
Okay.
Hold on. Here you are.
I
You
got
have.
it. I got it. Mine is the second one.
Okay. All right. You see, there are 2 sets of them. Okay.
All right, let's continue.
So you need that.
Well, here already you see the Baltic.
All right.
In this map, you see already the Baltic.
Yeah,
Kovno
right.
And Vilna.
So look at this. We'll start with this one, the one that's the top one that says the Jews of Russia from 1545. So there definitely were Jews living in Russia, but not so many. A lot of them are around that Black Sea area. This is the Crimea, right? Some of them settled there, and then eventually, of course, they will spread out. But we'll see what's going to happen during.
So these are Jews coming from Germany.
No. These coming from Russia around the Black Sea. They came up from more like from Israel to Syria to Turkey. These are like the Bukharan Jews. Probably,
is that what it is?
Probably come all the way from here. So that was sort of like a separate element, right? Then some German Jews might have found their way. Look, they say already, but most of these communities here are going to be settled by these Polish Jews who are now going to find their way under Russian rule. Yeah. All right, because when you look at the dates there, they have 1820. The only ones I have here in the 1500s, I have Jews, Baptists and Jewish goods from Poland. Jews are forbidden to visit or trade in Moscow. I had mentioned that to you. The Russians did not. The ruling, people did not want any Jews in their midst. Okay, and then the rest of it will be the 1800s. We're going to do the 1800s today. Look at also, if you turn the page. Look where it just says the Jewish Pale of Settlement. Okay, so that's from 1835. So this is going to be a little after Alexander time period going into the next czar will be Nicholas I. And you can just see, I'm sure you'll recognize a lot of the names. Look, if you go all the way to the east, you see like Kharkov, that was actually in Russia.
Krakow.
It's not Krakow, it's Kharkov. That's where all this fighting is happening now, right? You read the paper, you know, or the news, where the Russians, you know, and the Ukrainians, right? And this is the part that Russia has invaded now. That they took over all of the Crimea. And here's Kherson. This is also, that's another area where the Russians, I mean, current day, you know, have invaded, all right? But you can see there, so look up in the north, for example, there's Kovna and Vilna,
Right.
Vitebsk. All right, if you look to just below Vilna, you see Grodno, then you see Minsk. So we're now going to Belarus.
It's Poland.
But in
So it's
those
not-
days, it was
like-
Russian rule, right? So they'll say, so anybody, say if there are any grandparents who came from this area, they were officially Russian.
But why don't I see any Latvia? I see just.
Okay, because it was part of this area, just part of Latvia was under Russian rule and part of the Pale settlement. It doesn't include Estonia at all.
Because, yeah.
And just part of Latvia, mostly it was Lithuania. Yes,
The border is, the border, so that means that Jews live east of the border.
no, they only could live inside this border.
So this is a huge border here.
That's right. It was a
they were
very
quite
large
large.
territory. You'll see, it does shrink over time because they don't want the Jews to be anywhere near them.
But all
But-
this area,
That's the,
that's where the Jews live.
yes, exactly. Okay.
Minsk,
And you can see there's a part, you see how, on the left side, how they're very close to Germany. That's where I saw where it says there's
Right.
Balti. That's where I told you my Zeta, the Eisenbergs come from. And then that whole other area, to the left of Grodno. So, I mean, I'm sure you will recognize so many of these names, Rano, Lublin, Warsaw, you know, what I can.
Here.
Yeah, they're all,
Yeah,
but no, you have to, the part that juts out to the left. Kiev is not, that's right smack in the middle
in the middle
of the Pale settlement, okay, and that's Ukraine.
But the one on the right mentions the area, the name of the city and the number of the Jews, no? The one on the right.
Right, but talks about how Jews were expelled from these
So what,
places.
what are
They're
these
very
places?
small, they're, so talking about there's some thousands,
Yeah.
but
15,000.
we're talking about millions that lived in the Pale.
Why doesn't he mention the number here? It just mentions the
They-
number on the right.
They're, right, because they
But it
want to
should be
show
active.
you that there were very few who lived there. Here, and that's at a later date. Initially, they're all confined to the Pale settlement, except as I say, there were several thousand. Now, this, don't forget, this goes all the way up to 1917. So it could be some of these numbers that they're showing you among those thousands of Jews living to the east of the Pale settlement. They already maybe somehow were able to get permission to leave the Pale.
1917.
That's World War I.
Latvia was already in being. So why is it not in the?
I'm telling you, it was partially there. I could maybe, you know what, I have another, I was looking yesterday in the Encyclopedia Judaica, and they have a map there, so I'll have my husband make a copy of that, and then we can compare it
Okay.
to this.
Thank
All
you,
right,
Thank you.
all right, absolutely.
I want
Okay,
to see
so-
my heritage.
Right, so just, you know, hold on to all these maps, we will be making reference to them. Okay, and then there is another map here, the third one in this little packet says the Jews of Eastern Europe and Russia's westward expansion. In other words, because they get, if you remember, Poland is totally dismembered, right? It no longer exists anymore as an individual country. Most of it is now under Russian control, some under Prussian control, some under Austrian control. All right?
It's interesting because I see Riga here on the corner.
Yes.
Which means they must have been something, but not quite.
Right, exactly. I mean, there definitely will eventually be Jews, I know a sizable Jewish community actually lived in Latvia eventually. But perhaps not in those, in that late 1700s, early 1800s. So let me just, if you want to take out the original sheet that I handed out last week, and so many of you are new now, so I'll just briefly go over what's in here.
Which one?
The one that says the Jews of Eastern Europe, the Pale Settlement. Right?
Yeah.
Okay. We talked about the partition. Okay. All right, then it talks about how, you know, the land's going to be divided. Right, that third and final partition comes in 1795, and that's when a huge number of Jews become part of Russia. All right. Let me just see what else. I want to talk about Napoleon, so you understand. Now, but when I start talking more about Alexander the First, who reigned at the time when Napoleon grew to power, became emperor, right? Declared himself, and then he invades. Then wants to also conquer vast swaths of land, and he invades Russia. Of course, that campaign failed miserably. Okay, let me just see what else here. Then we talked about what the Jews used to. They were like minor peddlers, tradesmen. I looked up, you know, I saw one place was talking about that they were craftsmen. I think of crafts. I think of, you know, people who are very artistic or, you know, pottery making. When they say that they were craftsmen, they engaged in tailoring and shoemaking. Right? So now I can understand when all those Jews started coming to America, right, in the 1880s, so many of them found jobs in the garment district. Because that's what they were used to. That's what part of their they were engaged in, you know, when they still lived in Russia. All right, so we talk. I'll bring up more about Napoleon in a little bit. Oh yeah, let's just talk about religion. So the religion, right, of Russia. Well, I right here, I got this from one source. So they keep on calling it Greek Orthodox. I mean, just because it's Russian Orthodox, you know, with all those icons, and they were virulently anti-Semitic. Right? They did not like the Jews. Well, not most Christians, you know, underlying there, right, are all these anti-Jewish feelings. Unfortunately, the Jew was an infidel, a poisoner of the true faith. You know, this is how they viewed us. This goes back a ways. I had written there. Page talks about Peter the Great. Now he's the one who first starts modernizing Russia, all right? But his dates are earlier. He reigned a very long time, from 1652 to 1725.
Which page are you on?
It's the third. I know it's the next thing my husband put the numbers on, but this one, it's the third page of that one. And he had great hostility towards denying, you know, he wouldn't let any Jewish tradesmen, you know, enter his way of his territory. Okay, and then we talk about Tsarina Catherine the Great at 1762 to 1796. She also did not like the Jews. It's interesting. Just to remind you, I think we had done this last time. In the same year, so we're talking about 1762, Catherine permitted all foreigners to travel and settle in Russia, except the Jews. Here, it's this paragraph here. It says Russia on top. So it's the third page from last, not the one I gave out just now. This is from last week.
Is this the bill of settlement?
Yes, all right. Well, they
So
also
is that section where it says by Russian Jewry, is that what you mean?
No,
Third
third page.
This is number three.
Where are the originals?
This is the.
There we go.
Man.
No.
Look at the
You
bottom.
you have to look at where's the green and blue last week?
Phrases by birth. Just the
She would, she said,
Right.
put the map, put the sign.
It's
So we would say-
Because that's where I'm almost up to there. All right, but this is, this was, okay? This is where, okay, all right.
I mean.
I know the first, so that's.
Get free the German phrases.
Right, so then I talked about that, turn the page, let's go on to the next page,
Oh,
because I want to get to, we want to start today about more about Alexander. So let's get up to there. It's interesting, isn't this weird? She said she published a charter of religious toleration for her Muslim subjects,
that's good.
but they so hated the Jews,
That's good.
miserable conditions we had to live under to be so hated by everyone, and it's all coming out now.
What's
Even here in
your,
the US.
the fault of the dog, be malayo na
Yeah. Ay, yeah, yeah,
What's new? Nothing new.
right. But a lot of the land is now going to be ruled in that palace settlement by noblemen. Remember, because you'll hear stories of the Jews and the relationship, with the noblemen and their estates and, I'm sure you've come across some stories about that. Okay, so originally she was called this enlightened despot, right? So I'm up to where it says in 1772, that paragraph. She promised then 1717, so before so many Jews came under Russian rule. She said, oh, they can have all sorts of liberties, this is the first partition.
Oh, they enjoy the phone.
Yeah. What did they enjoy in Poland?
They had the light.
Within the next 2 days, as additional hundreds of thousands of Jews were added to Russia, there was that second and the third partitions, all right? Catherine decided to reconsider that promise. At this time, too, French Revolution. So this is French Revolution 1789. And everybody throughout Europe, all of America, they know about it too, are hearing about this and, this clarion call for freedom and emancipation and equal rights for all citizens, right? She said, this was very dangerous, right? So the monarchs, right, rulers all over Europe were very, leery of that these ideas of the French Revolution are going to spread to their people. Okay. So in 1794, right, this is how the Pale Settlement comes into being. She issued a ukase, that's a law, a rule of promulgation that confined the Jews to a Pale of Settlement. And so the Pale Settlement will go from 1794 all the way up to 1917, when the rule of the czars comes to an end, the Bolshevik Revolution. Okay. No Jew henceforth dare venture beyond this tightly quarantined territory. And we talk about that. How the taxes, excuse me, she doubled the taxes that the Jews owed.
Oh, that's of course.
Hey,
That's good.
now the kahals, remember they used to have a kahal, the community, center in each of these Jewish towns with a larger Jewish population. They were allowed to function, but only now for religious purposes. They used to have a lot more power. An edict of 1796 deprived these institutions of their former judicial powers. In other words, if among the Jews there was a dispute, a legal dispute, and they needed it to be decided by a court of law, they would go to the courts that the Kahal had set up. The false promise of freedom and modernization, the sabotage of civil rights and administrative efficiency were now transmitted to Catherine's descendants. And we'll see what Alexander and then later Nicholas were there. What were their attitudes towards the Jews in that period. Then I talked to you about Paul I, who was her son. But again, he was totally incompetent. He was then murdered. All right, and he was succeeded by Alexander the First. All right, now we're going to the last page
Right.
of that first thing I handed out to you. I did not get to that last. Is looking reigns from 1801 to 1825. Alexander I was an impressive man, tall, handsome, gravely courteous, and dignified in bearing. Much was expected of him by Russia's intelligentsia, for he enjoyed a vague reputation for progressivism. So at first they're highly impressed, and they think things are going to improve. It soon became apparent all the confusion, the contrariness, and the hesitation of his predecessors were concentrated in abundant measure in the new czar. So he's going to, again, part of it, it's fear of the influence of the French Revolution, and now Napoleon, right, who was spreading these ideas throughout Central Europe, and then eventually it's going to come to Eastern Europe. We're going to put the kebabs on it, right? They don't want any such changes happening in their country. Right, because now the Enlightenment starts actually in Western Europe. It's in France, it's in Germany. The Enlightenment does not come to Eastern Europe till later into the 19th century. So right now it's very backwards still. Very backwards. And like his, so he toyed, says here, with the notion of reforming. We're talking about Alexander the First. Talked about reforming his bureaucracy, but he stopped short of any notion of a limited monarchy. That's what we would call a constitutional monarchy, you know, that you share the powers with a legislation. Alexander was never quite sure what he really believed in. So he's torn between. He was profoundly emotional and was given to long, dreamy moods in which he identified with mysticism. Wait, does not remind you of the Tsarina Nicholas II's wife? Remember, and Rasputin? We were talking about coming into the 20th century, but you know somehow the Russians were very much influenced with this idea of mysticism. During the Napoleonic Wars, you all know it. Hope some of you have read, War and Peace by Tolstoy, which talks about the invasion of the French forces. And at first, just like what happens with Hitler later, they come in very quickly, but then they get stuck in the Russian winter. This is what happens. So during those Napoleonic Wars, which started 1803, that's when Napoleon starts, his campaign to conquer vast parts of Europe. And it ends in 1815. That's when he's defeated. The Battle of Waterloo. Remember your history. Anyway, Alexander scrapped his plans for reform altogether. This is very dangerous. And, I'm not going to listen anymore to these progressive, the people with progressive ideas. We have to put the kebabs on it all. He recognized that egalitarianism was becoming a dangerous weapon in the hands of Napoleon. He was also the first European monarch to be influenced by the religious obscurantism, very esoteric ideas that heralded the coming European reaction. So what's going to happen, a lot of people within these countries that Napoleon now invades and overtakes, they're very excited, and they think liberté, equality, fraternité, that's all going to come to them, and they will be the victors. But the monarchs, once Napoleon's defeated, they all go back, and at night that they become worse. So that's what we call reactionaries, right? They're going against any movement towards greater freedom, any granting of any civil rights. So at the Congress of Vienna in 1815, who led that? Do you remember his name? Count Metternich. All right. I was a history major, so and I love history, and I read about it all the time. So at the Congress of Vienna, the Tsar was frequently found to be on his knees, sobbing before a crucifix. He rapidly lost his stomach for godless liberalism. Alexander turned increasingly to conservatives as his friends and associates. You'll see kind of as a minister are very conservative. Hey, remind you of today? Okay. During the last years of his life, there was little progress of any kind in Russia, neither political, economic, nor intellectual. Very backward. It's going to get even worse, right? Than it had. First, it seemed like this bit of an opening, and even among, again, the Russian intelligentsia up until this 1815, they were entertaining ideas of emancipation, the granting of rights, I don't think they viewed it so much as to include necessarily the peasants. I guess serfdom, that's the agricultural, the nobility owned the land. So there's little progress in any kind of Russia during the last years of Alexander's life. He had determined to impose the doctrines of the church on his people, which is also obviously highly conservative, to return to the ideas of Byzantine medievalism. It was this split personality which sought to deal with the Jewish problem. Okay, now we can go to that next set of papers. All right, now let me see where I put mine up. So this one says on top right, the Pale of Settlement from the years 1801 to 1855. So we're going to discuss here the reign. Oh, you don't have this one?
No,
Oh, that was the new one that came in.
it's a new one. It's
Oh,
within
okay.
the big
You
table.
didn't pick it
In the
up?
big
Oh,
table,
okay.
you're
Oh,
up.
you-
Thank you so much.
course.
You know, but they're
Ah.
the
Glad I had them in different spots. I moved some here, so it'd be convenient for me, but right here. But it's just, Andrea always puts my newest sheets
Okay.
on the back table, so when you come in, you can, just take a copy for yourselves. Again, this is covering the reigns 1801 to 1855. First, we're going to Alexander the First. Do you have this?
Mhm.
This is the new one I gave out today. Do you have another one? I thought I handed it to you. Okay, if not, don't worry. This one. All right, excellent. And so he up until 1825 to 1855 will be Nicholas the First. And boy, does he really awful. Let's see what he does during his time. Not that Alexander, of course, is so great either. Okay, Napoleon has now been defeated, and with him all those beautiful ideas of emancipation and freedom and the idea of equality for all citizens. That's it. Comes to an end. And now the reactionary times are coming, so maybe they become even worse. We really want to put, tie down any possible feeling that people might have. So I believe there was one map that I did have here that showed Napoleon. Let's see, it's in one of these groups that I handed out to you. The one where I have here, the emancipation of European Jewry, I think we did that one. There's one here that shows Napoleon and the Jews. By the way, we do have to thank Napoleon when he entered places, parts of Germany and Italy. He actually broke down the ghetto walls.
I forget.
Right. But of course, after his defeat, sometimes which means again, but in Western Europe, once the people have the taste of this, they're not going back. They're not going to be so reactionary. There's a number of views of their leaders are, but and then you're going to have Germany will come out with the Nordics. That's under Bismarck from the 1870s, and then in Italy, the Risorgimento, where the Italians decided also they want their own independent country with equal rights for everybody. They don't want to be under the tutelage of just the church or parts of France were ruling over parts of Italy, and they wanted to get rid of it. Okay, so here you can just read over the thing about the Napoleon. All right, and the other map, this to show you about the Jews of Austria Hungary. Now, it doesn't become the Empire of Austria-Hungary till the year 1867. Before that, Austria is a separate country, Hungary is a separate country. But then it's they will be joined together, and that's under Empress Franz Joseph the second, I believe. So, did any of you ever read? I love this book. It's called Sisi. It's about his wife, who actually also was a German princess, and she, you know, it was an arranged marriage, and she, you know, do you remember Governor Pataki, New York State? So he had just a daughter, Allison, who's an author, and she wrote this book. Cece, I think maybe their family originally comes from somewhere in that, right? So she was curious about it. It's a great book, you know, and it's based on you know, the emperor's wife.
How do you spell Sisi?
I think it's Sisi. But if you look up Allison Pataki, you know, you'll find, and she's written other novels since, but that was the first time I got introduced to her, you know. So I think that you would enjoy. Again, this is going to be for a later time period. You know, we're talking about 1867 until the early 1900s. All right, let's go back to that tale of settlement, Alexander. So now let's see, how does Alexander, right? So his grandma died, right? Father's assassinated, and now he's now the Tsar. Alexander, so in the year 1802, remember, he first becomes the Tsar in 1801 after the assassination. Paul, he now appoints a committee to study the Jewish problem, wearing his cap of progressivism. So initially, you know, he's very imbued with these ideas of moving forward, introducing more liberal measures. The Tsar maneuvered the composition of the committee in such a way that liberals outnumbered the reactionaries. So he starts off being the good guy, right? Certainly, you know, the way we would look upon it. And he wants to offer more liberties to the people under his reign. The liberal members gradually took matters like hand, insisting it is more desirable and safe to lead the Jew to self-improvement with a minimum of restrictions and a maximum of liberties.
Good.
Yeah, sounds fantastic. When delegates from the Kahal were called in to represent the Jews, rumors began to circulate that better times were coming. So you can imagine how optimistic the Jews in the Pale Phillies now the very early 1800s. In 1804, the committee presented its report to the Tsar. Alexander unfortunately ignored the recommendation. Here, you know, he wants to improve things, you know, in under his reign, and now he's going to turn, you know, the very opposite. The statute concerning the organization of the Jews, issued by the Tsar in the same year, was a stunning reactionary document. And this is before, you know, 1815, you know, when the Congress of Vienna. This is after the defeat of Napoleon. This is even before he's becoming reactionary. The statute, known thereafter as the Constitution of the Jews, was a mixture of liberties and disabilities. On the one hand, the Kahals were deprived of much of their corporate authority. They were quite powerful, you know, starting in 1500 all the way through. And they basically were the only body, so to speak, ruling over the Jews, except for like tax purposes, you know, which had to go to the government. They were denied the right to impose their own taxes on the Jewish communities. I mean, how can you function without income coming in? Now they can't even tax, you know, the Jews, you know, who so to speak, members of the Kahal. They couldn't tax them anymore. Instead, they were obliged to confine themselves to the collection of state taxes. Of course, you can imagine how this has endears them to the general population. Nobody likes to tax collectors. Do you like the IRS? You know, I mean, but we have to. We government to function. You know, income has to come from some source. In addition, much of this is so interesting. The spiritual authority of the Kahals was stripped away through the elimination of the Chayrim, the ban on communication, excommunication. So, you know, as any Jew misbehaves in some fashion, you know, they would, you know, put the harem on them and then they'd be ostracized. And, so this was a way to bring them back within the fold or to listen to where they come. But those of you who have been taking my course for several years, so up until this time period, we had an organization in the Gulf of Poland, where Polish Jews lived, called the Bad Arba Artsot, which was for the Jews of Poland and Lithuania. It was a very strong, powerful organization, and all Jews were members of this Bad. Right, and they're the ones who set up the courts of law and the system of taxation, internal taxation. The Constitution further sought to encourage agricultural pursuits among the Jews. Now, the Jews were mostly, I told you, traders. They lived in small towns and villages. There are some Jews definitely living in the cities of the Pale, but they were not allowed to even own land. So how could they have ever engaged in agriculture? I don't know, with this glorious image of the peasants loving, tied to the land. So they went to Jews now to do this. It offered 5 years of tax exemptions to those Jewish families who would settle in the new territories of southeastern Russia, I guess an area closer to the Crimea area, and farm the land there. In addition, the Constitution granted the Jews free access to all public schools and universities in Russia. This sounds great, right?
Yeah.
But this was a ruse for conversion, as all public education in Russia was suffused with the Christian spirit. Now, I only went to Jewish schools my entire life, but my husband went to public school when he was younger, before he became full. And my mother grew up in a time period, I remember when, there weren't Jewish day schools, so everybody, you had to go to public school. And she all the songs, Christmas. My husband says he remembers that they used to have Christmas assemblies. I said, well, I had times, so. But and I remember my father was a little boy. I also had to go to public school. And I don't know, also was a thing there that the teacher insisted that the kids sing his Christmas hymns. And might say, it was very powerful. He didn't go to the teacher. He didn't go to the principal. He went to the superintendent of schools, and complained about this policy. And so he said, fine, the Jewish kids don't have to
I
sing
think
these.
in the public system, you have a system that there's no religion involved.
That's not true.
That's not true.
That's not true. And even today, but
I didn't
they
know that.
don't. And well, to
Now
them,
they want to bring
Christmas
back
is
the
like,
holiday.
I guess, more of a secular holiday, Santa Claus, trees and place, but that just the name Christmas, what it means. All right.
Well,
So let's
it's a
go on.
celebration of the birth. That's what it is.
Yeah, exactly. And New Year's Day was his bris.
It was. It was. Yeah. Oh, the eighth day. Yeah.
All right, let's just do like another paragraph.
He was a Jew. I didn't know nothing. He was a Jewish boy. I know nothing about Christianity.
Right. His mother and father were Jews.
They were Jews.
I know that concocted that immaculate conception.
The wonderful.
I'm trying to know what it is. And also they worship Mary, she was Jewish woman also.
Yeah. She was his mother.
Anyway, so let's just finish up at the end of page 1, all right? The entire point of the Constitution was abrogated by its key provision. Wow. So here, the idea that supposedly they were opening up and granting rights to the Jews were to be denied the right to hold leases on land or to operate taverns. And if any of you have ever read any of the stories, well, these have been at a later date from the Masculine, and they always talk about the Jews in the taverns, right? Because this was a big business. Now, the Jews themselves didn't drink, but they would sell liquor, right, to the peasants who would come to the taverns. And then you could also sleep there overnight if you were a traveling salesman, right? So now you can't do this anymore. And this was a big source of income for the Jews in this settlement. They were to be expelled from all the villages and hamlets to be sent back to the larger towns and villages. Now, this obviously does not happen, but this was the initial aim. With one stroke, the statute would have eliminated the livelihood of half of the Jewish population out of Russia. The result would lead to an even greater isolation of Jews from their Russian neighbors. The provision was scheduled to go into effect in 1808. Oh, sorry, 1808. Can't be 1908, 1808. Should I do one more paragraph?
Sure.
All right. And then, because then the next thing will be a little different. None of Alexander's objectives were attained. For one thing, the Jews repudiated those provisions of the Constitution that were openly directed at assimilation. I mean, these are Jews that, these are all observant Jews. This is before the Haskalah hits, right, Eastern Europe and Russia. Having little faith in the mercilessness of Russian justice. I mean, it was very arbitrary in how they made their decisions. Most Jews still consulted the rabbinic courts. They'll go to their beis din. You have a problem, turn to the beis din to adjudicate the case. They still observe their religious and cultural traditions as strictly as if the Cherem were still in force. I mean, they've been practicing as observant Jews now, for all these many, many years. And now to give it up to Alexander, was having this constitution. Agriculture held little, if any, attraction for them. Isn't it interesting? They don't have the Chalutzim, are the ones who come initially from this area, right? But at a much later date, we're talking about the end of the 1800s, going into the early 1900s. But by then, I guess they saw some purity and, going back and to, immigrating to what was then Palestine, ultimately land. And I guess now agriculture is trying to be enforced upon the people in this Pale settlement. This is what they should be engaged in. By the end of Alexander's reign, only amazing. Now remember, there are 1 million of Jews living in Russia. Only 2,294 Jews had relocated to the farming areas of New Russia. As you can see, it did not appeal to most of them. As for the thinly disguised attempts at conversion in the Russian school system, of 80,000 pupils, so not so many Russians attending Russian primary and secondary schools as late as 1840, only 48 were Jews. I mean, you just think, right, without a billion Jews, how few would go to those public schools? Even the threat of expulsion from the countryside could not have driven the Jews into apostasy. They weren't willing to give up, their religious lives. The brutish life of the illiterate and superstitious Russian peasant exercised no attraction to the literate, right? All Jewish boys, I mean, even girls, but rudimentary things. I mean, you have to be able to daven. Devoutly religious Russian Jew. This was the tragedy of Alexander's Jewish policy. It was fraught with contradictions and with self-defeating cruelties. It unfortunately was destined to be preserved with only many minor variations for nearly half a century. So for the next 50 years, the Russian authorities are still going to try to enforce, these limitations upon the Jews. The Constitution marked the true beginning of the long nightmare of Russian Jewish life. Okay, so we'll continue next time and see what's going to happen more under Alexander, of course. Okay. Hope you enjoyed everything. My great pleasure. My great pleasure always. Always. All right, and hopefully. Oh yeah. So next week, is Thanksgiving.
Well, yeah, no.
Oh, right, on Thursday, that's the next.
So
Yeah.
I usually don't teach on Thanksgiving. Is that okay with you guys? So we'll skip it 1 week. So I'll see you then. It will be in December.
So we're skipping next week.
Yeah, I was going to skip next week. Again, because are you going? I see the show here is making Thanksgiving dinner.
Yeah.
Well, what I do, my husband works. Oh, thank you. You did remember. I appreciate it.
I take something from somebody.
So I usually go to the restaurant.
First, I have to take care of the eat with this.
Ah, excellent, excellent. All right.
How are you?
Very good.
Thank you.
My great pleasure. I love teaching you. You're enjoying
And I
it.
love my. I love your enthusiasm.
Thank you.
Big more than one.
Yeah.
There you go, the kids for me.
Oh my God. So I'm waiting to give that. Oh, I did have a little bit of time. But it went before I do the next batch of butter from this time. You. That. That was a lot. That's my next part.
And then I was a lot.
All the countries, right? As they are my. It's amazing.
Okay, that's fine.
Thank you. Great to see you. Be well.
But you have to think.
All right, I'm just going to collect the other sheets.
Is there another?